When you think of breakfast today, you think of something quick: toast, cereal, maybe eggs. But what if I told you just a few decades ago in Canada, breakfast looked completely different, heavier, stranger, more traditional, and in some cases almost unrecognizable today? Meals that were once normal, daily, even comforting, have now completely disappeared. Not because they weren't good, but because the world changed, and today we're bringing them back. The 1950s marked a turning point. Life was becoming faster. Convenience foods were rising. Packaged meals started replacing traditional cooking, and slowly old breakfasts faded away. Not all at once, but quietly. One generation stopped making them, the next never learned them, and just like that, they were gone. So, let's go back to a time when breakfast wasn't rushed, but built to last the entire day. 1. Fried bologna and eggs. Before processed breakfast meats became standardized, fried bologna was everywhere. Thick slices cooked on a hot pan, edges curling slightly, served with eggs, sometimes bread. It was cheap, accessible, filling, perfect for working-class families. But over time it lost its place, seen as too basic, too outdated, replaced by packaged alternatives. But back then, it was a staple. 2. Salt-cod breakfast hash. Refrigeration wasn't always reliable, so preservation mattered. Salt cod was soaked overnight, then cooked with potatoes, onions, sometimes eggs. The result, a rich, salty, filling breakfast, especially common in coastal regions. But as fresh food became easier to access, salted foods declined, and this dish slowly disappeared. 3. Creamed chipped beef on toast. This was heavy, rich, and extremely filling. Dried beef cooked in a creamy white sauce served over toast. Warm, savory, comforting. It wasn't fancy, but it did its job. Perfect for cold mornings. But over time it became associated with older generations, and slowly it faded from regular breakfast tables. 4. Barley porridge. Before oatmeal became dominant, barley was common, cooked slowly, thick, nutty in flavor, often served with milk, honey, or even savory additions. It lasted longer, kept you full. But as oats became easier to prepare, barley lost popularity, and eventually almost disappeared from breakfast culture. 5. Fried bread with drippings. Back then, food wasn't wasted. Leftover drippings from cooking were reused. Bread was fried in them, creating something crispy, rich, deeply flavorful. It wasn't healthy by modern standards, but it was practical and incredibly satisfying. As food habits changed and health awareness increased, this disappeared. But once it was completely normal. Now, notice something. None of these breakfasts were light. None were quick. They were built for energy, for long days, for real work, and that's exactly why they existed. 3 main reasons. 1. Convenience. People wanted faster meals, less preparation, less time in the kitchen. 2. Changing lifestyles. Physical labor decreased. Heavy meals weren't always necessary. 3. Food industry growth. Packaged foods replaced traditional cooking, and slowly these meals became unnecessary. Breakfast didn't just change, it transformed from fuel for the day to something quick before the day. And in that shift, tradition was lost, and this is just the beginning. We'll uncover breakfasts that were even more unusual, more regional, and in some cases completely forgotten. The first breakfasts felt simple, working-class meals, heavy, practical, familiar. But now, we move into something different. Because these breakfasts weren't just about food, they were about where you lived, your region, your climate, your traditions. And once those lifestyles changed, these meals didn't just fade, they vanished. Canada isn't one uniform culture. It's a mix of influences: French, British, indigenous, and immigrant traditions. And breakfast reflected that. Each region had its own version of normal. But when modernization came, that diversity slowly disappeared, replaced by the same few options everywhere. Peameal bacon sandwich. Peameal bacon, a Canadian classic. Back then it wasn't just a specialty item, it was breakfast. Thick slices, juicy, rolled in cornmeal, served in a sandwich, often simple, just bread and bacon. Quick enough, but still satisfying. Over time, it moved out of daily breakfast into something more occasional, more special, and lost its everyday presence. In coastal areas, breakfast often came from the water. Fresh fish, lightly cooked, served with bread. No heavy seasoning, no complex preparation, just fresh, simple food. It was normal daily. But as diets changed, fish moved to lunch or dinner and disappeared from breakfast tables. Boiled eggs with salt pork. This was a serious meal. Boiled eggs served with salt pork. Salty, heavy, packed with energy. Perfect for people starting long physical days. But over time, it became too heavy for modern lifestyles. And slowly, it faded away. Cornmeal mush. Cornmeal cooked into a thick porridge. Simple, affordable, reliable, sometimes sweet, sometimes savory. It required time, attention, but it kept you full for hours. Then came instant cereals. Faster, easier, and cornmeal mush was left behind. Bread and molasses. This one sounds basic, but it was everywhere. Fresh bread, topped with molasses. Sweet, sticky, energy-rich. It was quick, but still traditional. Molasses was affordable, accessible, but as sugar-based spreads became common, this simple combination disappeared. Now something becomes clear. These breakfasts weren't just meals. They were solutions. Solutions to climate, work demands, and available ingredients. When those problems changed, the solutions disappeared. As transportation improved, food became standardized. The same ingredients became available everywhere, so regional meals lost their uniqueness and eventually, their necessity. Breakfast stopped being local. It became predictable. The same meals across cities and provinces. And in that process, diversity was lost. Today's breakfast is quick, light, and convenient. Back then, it was heavier, more varied, and more connected to daily life. And that difference is what makes these meals so interesting. And we're just getting started. Now we'll look at breakfasts that were even more unusual, sometimes surprising, and hard to imagine today. At first, the breakfasts we explored felt simple and easy to understand. They were heavy, practical, and built for a different kind of life. They didn't feel modern, but they still felt familiar. Now things begin to shift. These next breakfasts don't just feel old, they feel unfamiliar. Not because they were rare, but because today we've completely changed what we expect from the first meal of the day. Today, breakfast is often quick, light, and convenient. Something you eat without thinking too much about it. Something that fits into a busy schedule, but that wasn't always the case. There was a time when breakfast had a very clear purpose. It wasn't about saving time. It was about preparing for the day ahead. A day that often involved physical work, long hours, and very few breaks. When that is your reality, your food changes. It becomes heavier, more practical, and designed to last. The idea of light breakfast didn't really exist in the same way. People needed something that would keep them going for hours. One of the most common habits at the time was eating leftover stew for breakfast. Today, this might feel unusual, but back then, it made perfect sense. There wasn't a strict separation between breakfast, lunch, and dinner foods. If something was already cooked and still good to eat, it was used. A pot of stew from the night before would be reheated. It still had meat, vegetables, and broth. It was still filling, warm, and satisfying. And most importantly, it required very little effort. This way of thinking is very different from today. We associate certain foods with certain times of the day. We've created rules without even realizing. Another very common breakfast was fried potatoes with onions. This dish was simple but extremely effective. Potatoes are filling, and when cooked this way, they could keep someone full for hours. This was exactly what people needed. Over time, however, eating habits changed. As lifestyles became less physically demanding, the need for heavy filling breakfasts decreased. Then there is liver and onions, which feels even more unfamiliar today. For many, the idea of eating liver in the morning sounds uncomfortable. Liver is rich in nutrients. It was affordable and widely available. Cooked with onions, it became a complete meal. Pancakes also existed, but they were very different. Earlier versions were simpler, often served with lard or butter instead of syrup. As sugar became more available, pancakes became sweeter and lighter. The original version with lard disappeared, replaced by what we know today. Another common breakfast is saltfish with potatoes. This was especially popular in coastal areas where preserved food played an important role. But as refrigeration became common, the need for preserved food decreased. Salt fish with potatoes slowly faded from breakfast tables. When you look at all these meals, a pattern appears. They were created based on need. They provided energy that lasted and avoided waste. Today, food is often about convenience and preference. We choose what is easy and fits into our schedule. These breakfasts didn't vanish suddenly. One generation made them less often. The next didn't learn them. Eventually, they were forgotten. They were practical solutions to real problems. They helped people deal with physical work and limited resources. They were logical. In the past, breakfast was built around endurance. Today, it's built around speed. What remains constant is that food adapts to how we live. The real difference is not in the food itself, but in the world around it. And once the world changed, the food followed.
As we reach this stage, something becomes impossible to ignore. These breakfasts were never just about what people ate in the morning. They were part of something much larger, a system, a rhythm, a way of living that no longer exists in the same form today. Because when you really look at it, what disappeared after the 1950s was not just certain foods, it was a completely different relationship with food itself. There was a time when food was directly connected to effort. What you ate was closely tied to what you did. If your day demanded strength, your breakfast provided it. If your work required endurance, your meal supported it. There was a clear connection between input and output. Today, that connection is weaker. Work has changed. Movement has reduced. Schedules have become more controlled. And because of that, food has shifted from being a tool for survival to something more flexible, more optional, and sometimes even secondary. And that is where the biggest transformation happened. Breakfast used to be a foundation, something you relied on, something that set the tone for everything. It was not skipped, it was not minimized, it was built carefully, even if the ingredients were simple. Now, breakfast is often negotiable. Some people skip it completely. Others replace it with something quick and temporary. It is no longer the same kind of anchor it once was. And when that role changed, the meals that supported it disappeared too. Another thing that stands out is how deeply food was connected to awareness. People knew what they were eating, not just the name, but the process behind it. They understood how it was made, where it came from, and how it would affect them throughout the day. Today, food often arrives ready-made, packaged, processed, simplified. The connection between the person and the preparation is reduced. And when that connection weakens, traditions become easier to lose, because traditions require participation. They require repetition, they require time. And when any of those are missing, the tradition begins to fade. There is also something important about the predictability of these breakfasts. Not in a boring way, but in a stable way. People didn't always look for variety. They looked for reliability. That consistency created a kind of quiet confidence. A routine that supported daily life without needing constant change. Today, variety is more common. People like options. They like trying different things. While that adds excitement, it also reduces repetition. Without repetition, habits weaken. Without habits, practices disappear. And that is exactly what happened here. Many of these breakfasts required effort versus reward, not necessarily complicated but intentional. You had to cook or prepare something before you could eat. Today, the effort required for food has decreased significantly. You can eat without cooking. You can prepare something in minutes. When effort decreases, attachment often decreases as well. The more effort something requires, the more value it tends to hold. There is also the influence of time perception. In the past, time was experienced differently. Mornings were not always rushed in the same way. Now, mornings are often compressed. Everything needs to happen quickly. Meals become smaller, simpler, and faster. Another important shift is how food became separated from its environment. In the past, what you ate was influenced by where you were. Now food is more universal. The same items can be found in different places. This removes the uniqueness that once defined regional breakfasts, and when uniqueness disappears, so does identity. Many of these meals were expressions of place, of culture, of history. Food is one of the strongest carriers of memory. The way something tastes or smells can bring back entire moments from the past. But when a food disappears, those memories become harder to access. Over time, they fade. This is how cultural memory changes. One generation remembers something clearly, the next remembers it vaguely, and the one after that may not remember it at all. In the past, food was tied to survival. It had a clear purpose. Today, food is more flexible, which changes how seriously it is taken. Breakfast, in particular, lost its urgency. And when something loses urgency, it loses priority. That is exactly what happened here. It happened naturally. As life changed, habits changed. As habits changed, food changed. And as food changed, traditions disappeared. Quietly. Forgetting is often not an active process. It is the result of not remembering, of not repeating, of not continuing. These breakfasts were part of a world that required them, and once that world changed, the need for them disappeared. But even though they are no longer part of everyday life, they still hold meaning. They remind us that food is never just about eating. It is about living. It is about responding to the environment. It is about making choices based on what matters at the time. In the end, this is not just about listing forgotten breakfasts. It is about understanding why they existed and what that tells us about change. Because once you understand that, you don't just see food differently, you start to see everyday life differently. That is the real value of this story.
As we move further into these forgotten breakfasts, something even deeper begins to reveal itself. Up until now, we've seen meals shaped by practicality, by culture, by survival. But now, we step into a phase where breakfast was not just about need or tradition. It was about rhythm, about routine, about a way of life that moved at a completely different pace from today. Because what truly disappeared after the 1950s was not just food. It was the time and mindset required to make that food. There was a time when mornings were slower, but heavier in purpose. People didn't rush through breakfast. They prepared it with intention, knowing it had to carry them through hours of effort. And because of that, many breakfasts were built in layers, not just a single item, but a combination of simple foods that worked together. One such example was bread, butter, and preserved fruit combinations that were far more common than modern jam and toast. Back then, fruit wasn't always fresh. It was often preserved through methods like stewing or storing in natural sugars. These preserved fruits were not overly sweet like modern spreads. They had a deeper, sometimes slightly tangy flavor. Paired with thick slices of bread and butter, they created a breakfast that was simple but balanced. It provided carbohydrates, fats, and just enough sweetness to make it satisfying. But over time, as commercial products replaced homemade preserves, something changed. The flavor became standardized, the process became invisible, and the connection to the original method slowly disappeared. What remained was a simplified version, easier to consume but detached from its roots. Another breakfast that faded quietly was thick cream with bread or grains. In rural areas, dairy was not processed the way it is today. Cream was rich, heavy, and used generously. It was poured over bread, porridge, or even eaten on its own with simple grains. This created a meal that was incredibly dense in energy. It wasn't designed to be light, it was designed to last. But as dietary preferences shifted and concerns about richness and heaviness increased, such meals began to feel excessive. Modern diets moved toward lighter options, and heavy cream-based breakfasts became less common. What was once seen as valuable became something to avoid. Then there were breakfasts built entirely around leftovers, not just stew, but combinations of meats, vegetables, and grains from previous meals. These were not random, they were intentional. People knew how to combine what they had into something that worked. This required a level of awareness and skill that is less common today. In modern life, leftovers are often reheated without much thought. But back then, they were part of a system. Nothing was wasted, and everything had a place. Breakfast was simply another opportunity to use what was already available. Another forgotten pattern was the use of simple soups as a regular morning meal. Not just fish broth, but vegetable-based soups, grain-based broths, and light meat soups. These were easy to digest but still nourishing. They provided warmth, especially in colder climates, and helped prepare the body for the day. Today, soup is rarely associated with breakfast. It has been categorized into lunch or dinner. But this categorization is a modern idea. In the past, practicality mattered more than labels. There were also breakfasts that combined sweet and savory elements in ways that are less common now. Bread might be eaten with something slightly sweet alongside something salty. This created balance both in flavor and nutrition. Modern breakfasts tend to lean strongly in one direction, either sweet or savory, but rarely both in a natural way. Another example is the use of simple grains beyond oats. Barley, rye, and even crushed wheat were used to create porridge-like meals. These grains had different textures and flavors. They required longer cooking times, which meant more effort. As industrial food production increased, oats became dominant because they were easier to process and package. Other grains slowly disappeared from daily use, and with them, the breakfasts that relied on them also faded. There was also a strong connection between breakfast and season. In colder months, meals were heavier, richer, and designed to provide warmth and energy. In warmer months, they became slightly lighter but still practical. This seasonal variation is something that has reduced over time, as food availability became consistent throughout the year. Another overlooked aspect is the role of manual preparation. Many of these breakfasts required time. Not necessarily complicated techniques, but time. Time to cook, time to prepare, time to combine ingredients properly. This created a rhythm in daily life. As time became more limited and convenience became more important, meals that required even moderate effort began to disappear. It wasn't that people couldn't make them, it was that they didn't have the time or didn't see the need. This shift also changed the relationship people had with food. In the past, preparing breakfast was part of the day's structure. It was something that grounded the morning. Today, breakfast is often something that fits into whatever time is left. Another important factor is the influence of advertising in modern food culture. As packaged foods became more common, they were promoted as better, faster, and more modern. Traditional breakfasts began to feel outdated in comparison. People moved toward what was being presented as the future, and in doing so they left behind what had worked for generations. There is also a psychological aspect to this change. Food is not just about nutrition, it is about identity. When people began to adopt new lifestyles, they also adopted new eating habits. Breakfast became part of that transformation. It became a symbol of modern life, and anything that didn't fit into that image was gradually left behind. But what makes all of this interesting is that these forgotten breakfasts still make sense when viewed in the right context. They were not random, they were not poorly designed. They were highly efficient for the lives people were living. They provided energy, reduced waste, used available resources, and supported daily routines. In many ways, they were optimized for a different kind of life. Today, we live in a different environment. Our needs are different, our time is structured differently, and our food reflects that. But that doesn't mean the older system was less effective. It was simply built for a different purpose. There is also something to be said about the level of awareness people had about their food. They understood where it came from, how it was prepared, and how it would affect their day. This level of connection is less common today, where food is often consumed without much thought. Looking at these breakfasts is like looking at a different mindset, a mindset that valued practicality, efficiency, and sustainability. A mindset that saw food as part of a larger system, not just an isolated choice. And as that mindset changed, so did the food. What we are seeing is not just the disappearance of certain meals, but the transformation of an entire approach to eating. A shift from need-based decisions to preference-based decisions, from preparation to convenience, from connection to detachment, and that shift continues even today. Because, just like these breakfasts disappeared, the foods we eat now may not last forever either. As technology advances and lifestyles continue to evolve, new patterns will emerge. And what feels normal today may one day feel just as unfamiliar. That is the nature of culture. It changes, adapts, and sometimes forgets. But even when something is forgotten, it doesn't lose its significance. It still represents a moment in time, a way of life, a set of priorities that once made perfect sense. And that is what makes these breakfasts important. Not because we need to bring them back, but because they help us understand how people lived, how they thought, and how they adapted to their world. As we move into the next part, the focus shifts even further into meals that were not just forgotten, but almost erased. Breakfasts that existed within smaller communities, specific regions, and unique traditions. Meals that were never widely known, and because of that, disappeared even more quietly. And in those meals we begin to see not just what was lost, but how easily something can vanish, when it is no longer needed, no longer taught, and no longer remembered. As we move deeper into these forgotten breakfasts, something even more subtle begins to appear. Until now we've talked about meals that disappeared because lifestyles changed, because convenience took over, because traditions slowly faded. But now we reach a point where the disappearance becomes almost invisible. These are the breakfasts that didn't just fade from popularity. They slipped out quietly, without anyone really noticing they were gone. Because these meals weren't always written down. They weren't standardized recipes. They were habits, small, everyday habits that existed inside homes, inside families, inside routines that were never meant to be recorded. They were passed through observation, through repetition, through daily life, and when that chain broke, the meals disappeared with it. One of the clearest examples of this is the habit of eating simple bread soaked in liquids like milk, tea, or even diluted broth. This might sound extremely basic, almost too simple to matter, but that's exactly why it mattered. It was accessible. Bread that had become slightly stale could be softened and turned into something warm and easy to eat. It reduced waste. This kind of breakfast doesn't survive in a world of abundance. When food is easily available, practices like this start to feel unnecessary. Another quiet breakfast that faded away was the use of animal fats in the morning, not as a side, but as a central component. Fat was energy. It was reliable. It was used to cook, to spread, to add substance to otherwise simple foods. People needed long-lasting energy. They needed something that would stay with them for hours, and fat provided exactly that. There were also breakfasts built around very small combinations of ingredients, for example a piece of bread, a bit of preserved meat, and a hot drink. Today, we often expect more variety. But in the past, simplicity was not a limitation, it was a strength. Another pattern that has almost completely disappeared is the idea of eating based on availability rather than preference. People didn't always choose what they wanted, they chose what they had. Variation came from necessity, not from planning. There were also meals built around small portions of preserved foods like pickled vegetables, salted items, or fermented components. As food systems improved and fresh ingredients became more available, the need for these preserved elements decreased. Another interesting aspect is how closely breakfast was tied to work schedules. People woke up with daylight and worked according to conditions. As life became more structured, meals became more structured. Breakfast became a defined slot in the morning, often limited by time. Anything that required too much time, too much preparation, or too much variation began to disappear. There is also something to be said about the emotional aspect. These meals were familiar. They created a sense of stability. Another quiet disappearance is the loss of texture-based meals. Thick porridges, softened breads, dense combinations. As eating became faster, textures became lighter, foods became easier to consume quickly. Traditional textures disappeared. One of the most important things to understand is that these breakfasts were not designed in isolation. They were part of a larger system. When any part of that system changed, the meals changed as well. Over time, the impact became stronger. Some disappeared entirely. Food is not just about ingredients, it's about context. It's about how those ingredients fit into daily life. These breakfasts were never meant to be preserved in history. They were meant to be lived. In the end, this is not just a story about food. It's a story about people, about how they lived and shaped their world through small, consistent choices. Once those choices changed, everything else followed.
At this point, everything connects. All the breakfasts we've explored, all the patterns, all the small habits that slowly disappeared, they were never random. They were part of a system that made sense for the time. A system built around survival, effort, environment, and routine. And now, standing at the end of this journey, the real question is no longer what people ate. The real question is why it made sense then. Because once you understand that, you begin to see something bigger than just food. You begin to see how entire ways of living can change. There was a time when breakfast was not optional. It was the foundation of the day. It was the first step into a day that demanded something. It was not rushed. It was not ignored. It was not replaced. It had purpose. And that purpose shaped everything around it. The meals we've seen were not designed to impress. They were created to work, to support, to last. And that is what made them valuable. Today, the idea of value has shifted. Food is still important, but it is more flexible, more adaptably, and sometimes less connected to necessity. This reflects progress, convenience, and new ways of living. But it also means that certain things are left behind. Not because they were wrong, but because they are no longer needed in the same way. These breakfasts did not disappear because they failed. The world that required them changed. When work became less physically demanding, heavy meals became less necessary. When time became more limited, long preparation became less practical. When choices increased, simplicity became less attractive. The result was inevitable. The breakfasts changed gradually, one habit at a time, until eventually, what was once normal became unfamiliar. This is how cultural shifts happen, through many small changes that build over time, and food is one of the clearest ways to see that process. Because food is part of daily life. It is repeated. It is shared. Cold climates required warmth and energy. Physical labor required endurance and strength. Everything about these meals was shaped by those realities. Today, climate is controlled. Resources are abundant. Work is structured differently. Because of that, the same meals no longer feel necessary. But that does not make them meaningless. It makes them even more valuable as a way to understand the past. We see how people adapted. There is something important about the simplicity of these meals. They were direct. They did what they needed to do without extra complexity. In that simplicity, there was efficiency. There was clarity. There was purpose. Today, food can sometimes feel more complicated. In the past, people were more connected to their food. They knew how it was made. They knew where it came from. That connection included effort, understanding, and appreciation. Today, that connection is often reduced. Food is more distant from its source. Without connection, repetition becomes less meaningful. Without repetition, habits weaken, and without habits, traditions disappear. In the span of a few decades, entire breakfast traditions faded away. This shows how fast culture can change, how quickly habits can shift. If these breakfasts could disappear so quickly, what about the foods we eat today? Are they permanent, or part of another phase? Food will continue to evolve. New habits will form. Old ones will fade, and the cycle will continue. That is the nature of human life. What makes this story meaningful is not just the meals. They represent a way of thinking, a way of living connected to reality. In the end, this is not just about forgotten breakfasts. It is about understanding change. Understanding how small shifts lead to big changes. Normal is not fixed. It is always changing. Once you realize that, you begin to see things differently. You begin to notice patterns. So the next time you sit down to eat, think about it. Not just what you are eating, but why. Behind that moment is a history of change. There are dozens of breakfasts that once made just as much sense, that once felt just as normal, but are now completely forgotten.